Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Debra Lampert-Rudman. I'm the Executive Director of People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos. We come together on this luminous afternoon to celebrate literature and the way it brings people into conversation with one another, and this year's notable words in the afternoon light with our honored guest, Susan Choi, is an amazing way to celebrate that. In 1972, when our founder, Sarah Hirschman, began a small reading group in Spanish with Puerto Rican women living in a housing project in Cambridge, Massachusetts, she was guided by a simple belief about books and about people. Sarah once said, "Literature is such a fantastic thing, so rich and entertaining. It catches your emotions, makes you think, takes you on a journey. In this case, the journey is together with other people." That idea, that reading is a shared journey, still guides us today. Sarah believed deeply in literature and in people. We still do. Every week, in many different settings, from prisons to older adult centers, assisted living facilities, reentry and rehabilitation centers, and transitional housing, participants in our programs gather around a story in either English or Spanish. Together, they discover that their voices belong in the conversation, that their experiences illuminate the text, and that listening can change a room. That is the quiet, powerful work you are supporting by being here today, and we thank you. As we look ahead, our strategic plan calls us to carry that work forward with intention, widening access to new communities, deepening partnerships, and strengthening the foundation that will sustain this work for generations to come. We're not only honoring a 54-year legacy, we are building its future and look forward to celebrating our 55th year and beyond. So before we continue with today's program, I would like to recognize those sponsors and supporters whose generosity has made this gathering possible. We are deeply grateful to our inaugural Spirit of Sarah sponsor, Alison Cornell, who donates in loving memory of Macgyver, Choi, Jana, and Pebbles. Unfortunately, Alison is unable to be with us today, but we are grateful and honored that dear friends of hers are here in her stead. We send deepest thanks and appreciation to our literary leader sponsors, Tyler and Cheyenne Caton, who also unfortunately could not be with us today, but sent friends in their stead. We thank our benefactor sponsors, Charlie Busuttil, Darcy Donahue, and Lynne Fagles. Our many thanks to all of you. Our sincere thanks to our book lover sponsors, Ted and Jane Boyer. Happy to see you both here. And we shine the light of gratitude on our bright light sponsors, Andrea Honore and Charlotte Friedman, Richard Rudman, Jane Scott, and our friends at Lear Pannepacker, LLP, and Verus Construction. Please join me in thanking all of our sponsors, briefly. We are also deeply grateful to our Board of Trustees, led by the inimitable Board Chair, Charles Busuttil, whose thoughtful guidance helps sustain this organization. I would especially like to acknowledge People and Stories Gente y Cuentos' first Board President, Keith Wheelock, who's with us here today, and his wife, also a former board president, Georgia Whidden. I'm also honored to welcome some emeritus board members, Ann Seltzer and Lynne Fagles, who are with us today. Thank you. Your wisdom and dedication continue to inspire us. If you are a current or past board member and you are able, please stand or raise your hand so we can recognize you. Thank you. The path you helped build is the one we walk today. My heartfelt thanks to our outstanding coordinators. I think of them as a family. Each of these talented individuals brings with such care, dedication, and enthusiasm to the literature they share with our participants. Some have been coordinators for decades, others for only a year or two. Will our coordinators please rise or raise your hand if you're able? Look, there they are. It's a friendly room. I would also like to take a moment to thank Pat Andrus and single her out as a coordinator, and also as a former executive director and a beloved coordinator who has worked alongside our founder when People and Stories was in its infancy. Thank you, Pat, for being here. Through all of our coordinators' voices, stories come alive and conversations begin. Their work is truly at the heart of what we do. They're the lifeblood of People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos. Thank you. My thanks also go to our small but mighty administrative team who keep all the People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos program wheels turning. My thanks to the Princeton Theological Seminary for hosting us in this beautiful space. Thank you so much. To Shea Elise Catering for the reception you will eventually enjoy. And to Labyrinth Books for today's book signing. To Nick Marcello, whose welcoming music you've heard and will enjoy at the reception. And to Tim Sexton for generously capturing this afternoon through his wonderful photography. Now it is my great honor to introduce our esteemed guest. Side note, I'm a huge fan. Susan Choi is the author of the National Book Award-winning novel Trust Exercise, as well as The Foreign Student, American Woman, which was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize, A Person of Interest, and My Education. Her newest novel, Flashlight, which we celebrate here this afternoon, grew from a short story she first shared, many of you, at a Notable Words gathering with our community in 2022. Many of you here today may have been in the room or joined virtually during pandemic, and you may remember that evening well. I was not there, but I have heard about this since I joined People and Stories 4 years ago, so I'm overjoyed that she's with us. Flashlight has since grown into a nationally celebrated novel, and we are delighted to explore it together here today. What distinguishes Susan's writing is its moral depth. Her work asks us to sit with ambiguity, to examine memory, and to consider how identity is shaped through story. In that way, her work resonates beautifully with the spirit of People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos. We are deeply grateful to Susan for returning to generously support our mission and the communities we serve. Please join me in warmly welcoming Susan Choi.
Thank you so much, Debra. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. It's such a treat to be back in Princeton, where I taught for about a decade at the university from 2005 to 2015 in the creative writing program. I had a plan for how I was going to read to you today. I was going to talk to you a little bit about my book, and then I was going to read 2 sections. So Flashlight, this novel, is the story of a family, a small family. Louisa, who is the protagonist, her father Cirque, and her mother Anne. In the late 1970s, when Louisa is about 10 years old, the family goes to Japan for what is, meant to be a pretty consequential experience for them. They've never, Louisa and Anne have never been outside of the United States. Cirque, who grew up in Japan, has not yet ever been back to his homeland, so it's sort of a big deal that they're going, but it becomes a much bigger deal than any of them anticipate. They're in Japan, something happens to the family that shatters it forever. They didn't expect this, and the rest of the book sort of stays with this family as they both try to recover from what happened and try to understand what happened, which is not immediately clear to them. It's a catastrophe, but what kind of catastrophe, they don't know for sure. The book begins with this chapter that was published in the New Yorker in 2020, and which I read from in 2022. And in it, we find Louisa, 10 years old, back in the United States after this big trip. Her family has been demolished. She is not the nicest fourth grader you've ever met. And for this reason, she's been sent to a child psychologist who is trying to figure out what is the matter with her. I wanted to read a little bit from that, and then I also wanted to read from a chapter that delves into the life of a different child. And with your forbearance, I think I'm going to stick with the plan, but we'll see how long I read, and maybe I'll do something crazy and read a third thing that I've never read before. A funny thing about book promotion, I don't know if anyone's an author out there, but one of the things that's happened in the past 6 to 10 years, or at least since the last time I was promoting a book, is that when you go out to share a book with the world, there's much less reading aloud from the book, and there's much more conversing with someone about the book. So even though I've been promoting this book almost continually for the past 8 months, I have not read that much from it, which is why I was falling back on this all too familiar reading. But I will then read something different, and then maybe I'll just read yet another thing. Now I'm going to say goodbye to you, because in order to see the page, I have to take off the glasses that let me see you. So you have vanished for me, but I'll be happy to put the distance glasses back on and be able to see you again. So as I've mentioned, Louisa has returned to the U.S. from this life-changing trip to Japan. She is not doing very well in school, and she's been sent to a child psychologist. She and her mother are now living with her aunt. The appointment had been in a brick office building with half a flight of stairs at the entrance, and as they climbed, her aunt had said, "This is why your mom couldn't come with us, because of these stairs. I called ahead to ask if there were stairs at the entrance, and sure enough, they told me there were. Your poor mama." "She's not sick," Louisa said. "What's that, honey?" Louisa was silent. "I didn't hear you, honey." Now Louisa could pretend she hadn't heard. This was effective. No one was ever listening closely. Even the people who especially claimed to be listening were not really listening. It was this way with the man at the appointment. "My name is Dr. Brickner," he said, making a show of bending down to shake her hand. He had already made a show of leaving her aunt in the waiting room, and another show of reassuring Louisa that her aunt would be right there waiting for her, as if Louisa were in any fear her aunt might disappear. Louisa's aunt was like a bright light Louisa couldn't turn off. On the nights Louisa's mother wasn't up to it, it was her aunt who tucked Louisa into bed and then lingered too long in the doorway. Louisa's aunt broadcast her kind disposition by constantly tilting her head to one side, crinkling her eyes, and compressing her mouth, as if to savor all the good-tasting mirth trapped inside. Sometimes, performing this face for Louisa's aunt added reminiscent comments about her 2 grown-up sons and how precious it was to be reminded of them by Louisa's presence in her home. Louisa doubted her aunt felt this way. Until she and her mother had moved here, Louisa had never heard of this aunt or this uncle, her mother's actual brother, apparently, whom Louisa was now supposed to pretend she'd known about her whole life, her whole 10 years of life, when she had never heard their names or seen their photos or received a card or a gift from them on her birthday or answered the telephone and heard either one of them ask for her mother or her father. Now she lived in their house and drank orange juice with them staring at her. They behaved toward her the way all adults did since her father had died, with a combination of hearty attention and squeamish discomfort. Brickner, like this ugly brick building we're in, the man had gone on heartily. "That's how you can remember. But my first name is Jerry, and I'd like you to just call me that. Can I call you Louisa?" "So I don't need to remember," she said. "What's that?" He pointed his grin at her. "What did you say?" "I said, I don't need to remember Brickner like this ugly brick building," Because you said I should just call you Jerry. The man reared back and raised his eyebrows. Let me guess, you're a very smart girl. At least enough to be in 5th grade. Oh, they've lied to Louisa and told her that the meeting is about what grade level she's going to be in, because she's in 4th grade. She's been held back. At least enough to be in 5th grade. Oh, I'll bet there's no doubt about that, Jerry blathered, not listening, which was when Louisa knew the appointment was not about grade level. The room was full of admittedly interesting things, art supplies and those faceless wooden figures meant for posing, as well as actual dolls of different sorts, ranging from the sloppy, floppy Raggedy Ann style to the realistic infant style with a hard plastic head, hands, and feet, and a queasily soft trunk, arms, and legs. Wild-haired Barbies and those soldier Barbies for boys, the G.I. Joes. There was an off-kilter dollhouse, the kind meant to be played with and not just admired, with cluttered furnishings and slightly different sizes, as if there had been a disagreement about which scale to use. Louisa knew about scale, about 1 foot equals 1 inch. Her father had made her a dollhouse the year she turned 8. That had been the year of her passion for a store at the mall called It's a Small World, which sold shrunken, elaborate gingerbread homes into which she would gaze, mesmerized. Their every visit to the mall, her mother gave her 20 minutes to browse in the store as a matter of policy, placidly ignoring her pleas that they actually buy something. Her father, by contrast, only needed to hear her plead once. Off they had stormed to the mall, her father lambasting her mother's cheapness the entire drive there. Into the store, and then immediately out he had stormed once he'd seen the first price tag. I can make that, he'd said. The tiny nails tacking the thin walls of hobby plywood together made the walls split and splinter. The roof had been shingled with strips of a rough rubber matting found in the basement. Wallpaper scraps were cut down to size for the walls and floor. He'd even made much of the furniture, sitting at the kitchen table night after night in his undershirt with a glass of beer and his pipe clamped between his rear teeth, cutting and gluing strips of balsa. Her father's labor awed and grieved her. Louisa had been horrified by the clumsy, indelicate house, though her horror was silent. He was toiling to make something ugly she didn't desire. Yet over time she'd realized that this too held the charm of the small. Then she would spend hours on the floor gazing into her strange handmade house. Louisa. She was startled to find Dr. Brickner just over one shoulder. She turned away from the dollhouse, stepping neatly around him, and dropped into a chair. Moments before, the thing to do had been to shirk his eye contact and look at the things in the room that weren't him. Now he'd caught her interested in something, and the thing to do was shirk that something. They were alone together, and no one had told her how long this would last, but let it last forever. She wouldn't give him anything. "You can play with the dollhouse," he said, and she was pleased to hear a tinge of supplication. "That's what it's there for." "That's okay." "Would you like to draw? I have terrific drawing stuff." "That's okay. I don't really enjoy drawing." Right away, she regretted this offering. Sure enough, he caught on. Perhaps he was actually listening. "What kinds of things do you enjoy?" Certain adults could do this, Louisa had noticed. Instead of oohing or saying, "You sound so grown up when you talk," these adults deftly plucked your own words from the air and then flicked them back at you as if they thought you might somehow not notice and become hypnotized. It was a game, and not a playful type of game, but a competitive, scorekeeping game, the quick-witted adults snatching one bit of you after another. "What's that flashlight for?" Louisa asked him, and his mind had to spring to flashlight and pretend the question was one he'd expected. The flashlight stood on the windowsill, bulb end pointing down. The windows in the room were very large, with very deep sills, and the deep sills were cluttered, as every surface in the room was cluttered, with potted plants set close together, and in the bits of space in between them, ugly artworks made from balls and tubes of clay incompetently stuck together, and other knick-knacky arts and crafts garbage Louisa supposed other children had made during their appointments. The flashlight hardly stood out. Dr. Brickner had to crane his neck around in awkward, almost panic to find what she was talking about. "It's to see in the dark," he said clownishly. "You have lights." He abandoned the clowning. "It's in case of a power outage, which doesn't happen often, but it could happen, especially if there's an earthquake. Where I lived before I moved here, I felt earthquakes all the time. In Japan." She was disappointed somehow that he already knew this, but of course, he already knew everything. "Can we turn out the lights? It won't be dark. You could pull the blinds down. It still won't be dark. It will be dim," Dr. Brickner predicted, but he was already doing it. The blinds were an ancient, unreliable mess, and they clearly were never let down. As Dr. Brickner struggled with them, they fought back, their long metal strips rattling and seesawing and releasing a dust plume before they seemed to surrender and fall all at once. Dr. Brickner, reaching over his desk toward the chair where she sat, held the flashlight out to her. It was satisfyingly heavy. Louisa slid the plastic switch with her thumb, and a pale cloud of light appeared on the ceiling. "Oh, good," he said. "I thought the batteries might have gone dead." "If they were, and this was an earthquake, then you'd be in trouble." Very true. She played the light over the ceiling, almost forgetting about him. The ceiling was far above her, twice as far as the extinguished overhead light. The faint pool of light rippled over the ceiling and slid down the wall, seeming alive, a being both at her command and mysterious to her. "Do, do, 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 do," she sang, inexplicably goofy. She was singing the notes everyone nowadays recognized, the UFO's greeting from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Dr. Brickner laughed. They gazed up at the ceiling as if something were actually there. "Did you like that movie?" asked his voice, which she found was more tolerable than when she had to look into his face. "It scared me." She was surprised and annoyed by her honesty. "Why?" She shrugged, waving the beam over the ceiling as if in erasure, just in a fun way, like Halloween stuff. "Is that really all you meant?" She'd let the door open a crack, but he was too large and slow to slip through. She had already closed it. She almost felt sorry for him. The hidden side of her contempt for adults was pity, that they proudly imagined they understood her and then blundered while she had to pretend to be caught. She sang the alien greeting again, conducting with the flashlight to make a 5-pointed star in the air. "Did you like Star Wars?" Dr. Brickner wondered. "Sure." "So you like sci-fi?" This she couldn't allow. Close Encounters isn't sci-fi. Everything in that movie is normal. That's what makes the aliens feel really real. And that's scary. "No, those aliens aren't scary at all. They're nice." "Then why would their being real scare you?" "It doesn't. And besides, when they land, they look fake." "But you just said they felt really real." He was onto something, his triumphant tone told her, as if he won a point for every little crack where her words didn't fit themselves smoothly together. She swung the light into his face and he squinted, but didn't scold her, so she swung it away again as a reward. "I didn't. They don't. But the signs that they're coming, the weird radio sounds, the lights in the sky, the dad who builds that tower out of mud and his family thinks he's gone crazy. Maybe that felt really real. She said nothing. Normal life turning strange. Did that feel really real? Are there things in your own life that feel that way? I'm going to stop with that section. And it's not suspenseful because don't, please. I'm not done. But thank you very much. Well, that shouldn't be suspenseful at all since many of you have heard it already. But the section that I want to jump to now is another childhood section. I've mentioned that the book is centered on this small family, the two parents and their daughter, Louisa, who travel to Japan, and this life-changing event happens to them. When I was working on the book, I got lost a lot in time because there's a lot of things that happen. What I just read to you from is the very opening of the book, but then the events in the book both reach back into, a time period that precedes that scene, and the events also move forward in time. So if we start in the late 1970s, the book then moves back into the 1940s, and then it also moves forward. So we cover a lot of territory here. The child that you meet in the next chapter, spoiler alert, it's a young boy named Hiroshi. He is an ethnic Korean boy, but he's been born in Japan. His parents are Koreans, very, very poor Koreans, who have migrated to Japan, the Japanese archipelago, from the Korean peninsula in search of a better way of life, basically in search of work. Quick history lesson, which you don't really need to read this chapter, but since I'm trying to give you some sense of why we're going to read this chapter, forgive me if you already know all of this history, but in the early 20th century, the Empire of Japan took Korea forcibly as a colony. So if you were a Korean person, you became a subject of the Japanese Empire. And the boy that we meet, Hiroshi, who's a Korean boy, is in this situation. It is the 1940s. It's during World War II. The Japanese Empire ceases to be an empire when World War II comes to an end, the Japanese being not on the winning side, as a lot of you probably remember. But this is before that has taken place. So Hiroshi is this Korean boy living in Japan with a Korean family, but because he goes to school in Japan, like all children do, he has to have a Japanese name. He's not allowed to have his Korean name. And all of this belongs to a context that Hiroshi, being a very young boy, doesn't understand. But in the scene I want to read to you, he maybe begins to understand this a little bit. So it is 1940. It is late 1945 for the students of history. It is late 1945. So you'll understand what that means in a minute. Lots of things have been changing. One afternoon, a fresh disturbance rearranged the afternoon street, which recently had happened so often that Hiroshi was less aware of the difference between uneventful and agitated than he was aware of varieties of agitation. There had been that summer day of the war's abrupt end, when running shouts had streaked past like comets, until one threw open the door to the classroom, and their principal, shocking in his loss of composure, cried out that the emperor was on the radio and they all must run home to their parents immediately. There had been a different tone of clamor the day American troops first arrived in their small seaside town. Today's disturbance was somehow furtive. It zigzagged like a mouse, rather than sweeping all persons with it like a tide. It found Hiroshi in the form of a friend of his mother's, one of their slum sisterhood who treated all the children with equal rough authority. She yanked him close and barked, "Get your mom out here fast," in his ear. In the distance, he heard shrill whistles, lively cracks like artillery fire, and beneath them, at slow intervals, a more menacing, thunder-like boom. Such phenomena would generally empty the crowded street in the direction of the sound, and yet he sensed a hesitancy around him, and observing eyes followed him as he ran. "Auntie Kim says come fast," he conveyed, and somehow his mother, with his sister by the hand and his brother on her hip, unquestioningly followed him. "I told you," Auntie Kim said to his mother. "I told you." Whatever it was she had said to his mother couldn't be guessed by Hiroshi as he darted his glance back and forth between his mother and the source of warlike noise that had come into view. A ragtag parade, perhaps 3 times 10 women and men, messily anticipated and flanked by running children and a few wobbly cyclists. The formation of persons was loose, but their repeated shouts were loud, and several poles bobbed from their midst, from which snapped a standard-size United States flag, such as he'd already seen flying from the back of military vehicles on the coast road. A white flag, so many times larger than the U.S. one, of so much seething, undulating fabric that 3 men were struggling to control it on its pole, and a skinny white banner. The symbols on both the enormous white flag and the skinny white banner were illegible to him. He could see a colored medallion at the center of the flag, red and blue swirled together like the crests of 2 waves. And at the corners of the flag, short and longer black dashes making different designs. On the banner were markings that, unlike those on the flag, he knew for certain were words, but unnervingly, they were not words he recognized. "What does it say?" he asked his mother urgently. "What are they yelling?" Auntie Kim snarled in disgust. "The smartest boy in his school, and he can't even read his own language." "I can read," he said furiously, "if they write it correctly." But the women were ignoring him now. "Aren't they afraid?" his mother implored, sounding frightened herself. "I told you," Auntie Kim repeated. "But what if they're arrested?" "They won't be. The Americans say we're liberated now." "The Americans were our enemy," Hiroshi scolded the mothers. Was it possible this was the first time he'd ever seen his mother outside their home? She certainly acted as though she'd never been outside before. "The Americans inflicted unthinkable cruelty on us. Our job now as Japanese is to take them in hand and show them how to make peace." "Korea is free," Auntie Kim concluded. And then, to him, "Are you paying attention? That's what the banner says. That's what they're shouting. That's our own flag." The fishmonger on the main shopping street owned a radio, and sometimes Hiroshi loitered nearby and watched him tune it, the man's calloused fingers touching the dial so slightly Hiroshi could not even see the dial change position. But something would shift. Out of a spraying static would resolve spoken language, like a melting in reverse, the puddle lifting into a lace of snowflakes. Something like that happened after Auntie Kim spoke. Hiroshi understood that the incoherent noise that had meant nothing to him was in fact 2 languages, overlapping and dismantling each other, until his realization helped him tease them apart. The language he spoke and wrote at school every day, and spoke at play and in the streets of his town, and the language his parents used with each other, mostly at night when they thought he was asleep. He knew this language also. He understood it when he heard it directed at him, but it rarely left his mouth, and he had never learned to write it down. The parade had moved past, and the crowd closed in its wake, as if trying to decide whether to join. The enormous flag heaved and snapped in the distance like a sail pulling free from its mast. Korea is free, and long live Korea, and out of darkness into light were all three being uttered in his school language and in his parents' late-night language, both at the same time, so that as his intense concentration on the cacophony flagged, and as it drew farther away, the filigree of clarity collapsed, and all he heard again was meaningless noise. But what's Korea? He asked as they turned to walk home. Let me die, Auntie Kim said. Korea is the homeland of Koreans, his mother told him. But what are Koreans? We are, said his mother. You are. That's why your name isn't really Hiroshi, it's Sok. What do you mean my name isn't Hiroshi? He cried. I told you, Auntie Kim said to his mother again. His mother replied, but what choice did we have? Thank you. I feel like that's a perfect opening to questions. Does that seem like a good place to break for questions? It's my afternoon. Well, I enjoyed reading that to you so much, but I would actually love to see if people have questions, and if no one has questions, then I'll just find something else to read. Yes?
I can probably project from here. So a short story, in stories is not just a small novel, right? It has its own sort of architecture and movement. And so I'm curious, since Flashlight began as a short story, how did you know, or when did you know, oh, I think maybe there's something more here to tell, and what needed to change in order to grow this into a novel?
Thank you. I'll repeat the question in essence, which is, how did I know when the short story Flashlight was going to be a novel, and what are the differences and what was sort of required to make it into a novel? Yeah, just to give the background again for those of you who weren't here in 2022, the first chapter of this book was in the New Yorker as a short story in 2020, and it is Louisa and Dr. Brickner kind of facing off, and it ends with Louisa, having gotten into some trouble. The truth of the relationship between the story and the book is that by the time that short story came into existence in 2020, I was already floundering around in a big heap of material about this family that I had already written. I was already trying to write a novel. So it wasn't that the story grew into a novel, it was more that the novel failed to take form, and I was able to take a part of it and kind of, beat it into shape and make it function as a story. But I already knew all sorts of other stuff about these people, and I had already written a lot of material about Louisa's family. So from the point at which it ran as a story to the point at which I kind of knew what kind of novel it would be, I think the biggest thing that I had to do was figure out how many of the things that I imagined happening to this family would be in the book. Because I knew that I had this family that went to Japan, this thing happened to them, their lives changed forever, but how much I would tell the reader about what their lives had been like before, so how much of the background, like what I just read, and also how far I would take the reader with them into the future, and how much of what had happened to them would be revealed and resolved. Those were the big questions. So even though in 2020, I already had all this material. It was a lot of further writing of material and then organization. I'm trying to understand, how long would we stay with these people? I'm not sure how much I should give away for those who haven't read, but Louisa starts out, she's 10, and we actually travel with her quite a ways through her life after this event takes place. Yeah.
So I read that you were inspired to write this novel based on Japanese girls being kidnapped by North Korean spies in 1960. Many of them went to North Korea as a translator, and they were sent back later. But from that story to this, your story about Suk being kidnapped, and then her daughter not being kidnapped. And I was interested in how you come up with that idea. And also I was wondering how much your personal experience or your family experiences influenced your path.
Yeah, that's a great question. Spoiler alert. There are two parts to the question. One is how much did my personal experience affect the book, and the other is how did my interest in these real life events in Japan come into the creation of the book. So I'm going to answer them in reverse order from the way you asked. The personal experience is quite critical to the existence of the book, but the book doesn't really resemble my personal experience at all. So let me explain. When I was young, when I was about Louisa's age, and hopefully not that much like Louisa, my mother says I was not like Louisa, which is really nice. She read the book and called me, and she said, "But you weren't obnoxious." And I was like, "Thank you, Mommy. It's good to know." My father was Korean. He shares almost no, apart from very superficial factors, being a Korean and being an academic, becoming an academic in the United States, he shares almost no qualities with this character. It was sort of by design, because I had become very interested in the history of Korea and its intertwined history with Japan because of my father, but as a result of a lot of reading that I'd done about the two countries and their histories, I had learned a bunch of things that made me want to create this different character in this book who has a very different life than my father had. My father came from a quite privileged background in Seoul, was actually, a child of considerable wealth, very highly educated. His father was a scholar. They were landowners. It was a very different situation. And this boy, Hiroshi/Sok/Sirk, is sort of represents this completely different way that someone might have lived during my father's same lifetime. He comes from a very poor family. They have no advantages. They're living in Japan when Japan loses the Second World War and ceases to be an empire, loses all of its colonial holdings, including Korea. The ethnic Koreans who are still in Japan really ended up almost like people without any sort of state, any sort of nationality. They were, and to this day, descendants of those Koreans, that community is called the Zainichi, have had a very hard time in Japan because they weren't given citizenship. Also, Korea ceased to be what it had been and became two countries that hadn't existed before, North Korea and South Korea. They belonged to neither of those countries. So it was this really interesting situation that I wanted to invent a character to explore. Back to my life, I did go to Japan in my childhood with my father and mother. My father was on a sabbatical. And so we lived in Japan for, like 6 to 8 months. And nothing life-changing happened at all. But it was life-changing for me because I had, never been outside of the United States. I had been born and raised in the Midwest. And I had never been in a place where everyone was Asian. So I had been growing up in the Midwest where almost no one was Asian except for me and Caesar Aquino, who I, to this day, hi Caesar. We were supposed to marry each other according to the 3rd grade, but it didn't work out. So when I had this experience in Japan, it was extraordinarily impactful for me, and I always wanted to write about it, but there was no story, right? There was no story. Years later, I always sort of interested in Japan, read an article in the Times about this series of unexplained disappearances that had taken place in Japan, actually in the 70s, right around the same time that we had lived there. Now, this hadn't affected me at all, but I was very struck by that coincidence, by the fact that these catastrophes had taken place while we'd been in the country. And so that was the germ of the book, if that makes sense, is, I had this childhood experience without much of a plot. And then I had this interest in these real events that had happened in Japan that had been very consequential for other people. And it was years before I sort of, slowly moved away from both the real news stories and my real childhood to something that a fictionalized version of both things, that those two things could mingle, if that makes sense. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you so much. This may just be an intermezzo, a palate cleanser, but many of us are very hopeful and excited. And if you don't mind, tell us what you think about being named for the Women's Prize long listed this week.
Thank you. Wow, thank you for bringing that exciting news into the room. I have been longlisted for the Women's Prize in Fiction, and thank you. I mean, I'm thrilled. It's always astounding to be singled out. I mean, it's a 16-book list, which is astounding because hundreds and hundreds of books were considered for this list, and it's a list that it's a prize that is given in the UK, and so it's a very international. I believe any work published by a woman in the English language qualifies. So it's an international prize. The list is amazing. All of the other books on it, all other 15 books are. I mean, I haven't read them all. I have hopes of reading at least some of them over the next few months. I'm familiar only with one or two, actually, already, but I know of a lot of the authors, and I'm sort of thrilled. And it doesn't. I mean, the best thing to do for me in situations like this is to be really happy about being longlisted and to not think like, oh, what if I'm shortlisted? Oh, what if, it's really better to just end it right here and say like, this is great. This is great. Gosh, if I get shortlisted, that'll be really tough. Like I'll have to go to London. Oof. I don't know. So, I'm busy being really happy with it as it is. I think anything like this is always really nice for everyone who's working with me on promoting. My publisher is really happy, and I really like my publisher, and I like everyone who works there, and it's nice that they're happy. So they're all elated, and I'm glad. Yeah.
How did you do the research? Because North Korea is a very closed country, so how would you be able to? There's so many people that know really about North Korea. Was there a way that you were able to do the research to make it so in depth?
Thank you. So the question is about how did I research North Korea? And yes, spoiler alert, the book does have a lot to do with North Korea, as well as Japan and South Korea and the United States. The book travels, you can sit in your armchair and go around the world. The North Korea research was really difficult, and North Korea is a very closed society. I do know people who have been journalists, writers. If you go, I've spoken to a lot of them, you're so managed that you almost see less than maybe if you just stayed home and read a lot. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration, but you're completely managed and surveilled and handled from the minute you arrive to the minute you leave, and what you get to see and who you get to talk to, it's like a Potemkin village situation. It's all highly scripted. So I was so worried about the fact that I ended up inventing this story that required me to depict North Korea, and one of the reasons the book took so long is I kept thinking, oh no, don't do this, like you can't do it. That the first draft that I turned in, the North Korea scenes were very impressionistic, and my editor, sort of said like, the North Korea scenes are not really convincing yet. And I said, I know. I was sort of hoping they could be dreamlike. So I ended up doing a lot of, in addition to doing a lot of the sort of usual sorts of research, like reading a lot of academic work on North Korea, a lot of amazing journalistic work. The best book that I had found was a book by a woman named Barbara Demick, who's a journalist. I actually list her book. I have a list of books in the back of this book, which are the most important books to me for writing this book. Barbara's is one of them, and it was this extraordinary book called Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea. Barbara had found a number of North Koreans who had survived the escape process. They had gotten out of the country and lived to explain how. And she interviewed all of them at great length and really won their trust. And then she retells all of their stories, kind of cross-cutting between these different stories. It's almost like a thriller. As you read each person's story, you just can't believe how will they survive. But they must have, because eventually they went and met Barbara. So this book had been so influential to me, I realized that there is nothing like first-person testimony to really help me understand what life was like. And so after reading Barbara's book, I sought out every first-person testimony of a North Korean escapee that I could find, and I just read them. And a lot of those books have been controversial because, some of the authors have been accused of, fabrication or inconsistency, but the truth is when you dig into each case, the fabrication is so trivial, like they got some dates wrong or this, that, or the other, but like the bulk of the story, which is that these people lived in prison camps within a nation that is itself a prison camp, and that they somehow were able to escape is unavoidably true. And so I think if you read a lot of those accounts, the truth feels very present. So that was really helpful. That's what I mainly relied on. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I loved about this book was learning about the history, a very complicated history that I didn't know anything about, but it's also sort of a very complicated family. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of, there's this whole body now of interviews that you've done, and there's an interview I listened to, and I think the person who interviewed said, it's a story about love conquering all. And I was like, oh, that is so not what I felt, at all. And I guess, I'm curious because I think one of the things that I felt quite strongly, and I don't know if this was anything you started throughout, is I felt so much like it was a story about love being present, but these really sort of trauma kind of making these very complicated people even more, very difficult, and also so love being almost hard to demonstrate, and sort of the sadness, or maybe just the reality of it never sort of conquering all. And so I'm curious kind of how those two reads, what you think about those two different readings. Sort of what you think about those two different readings of the text, like love does it all and fixes everything, or does not, and maybe is that something you were thinking about in any way, sort of was there a family dynamic that you were hoping to illustrate, maybe one way or the other?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll repeat just a little of that, which is I like the love conquers all, your skepticism about that. Hearing, I think, a reviewer or a critic describe the book as being a love conquers all book and thinking, really? I feel about the book in two ways that I think are kind of contradictory, but to me it makes sense. On the one hand, I do feel that the book is very affirming of the power of love and the bonds of love, and I say that because mainly I did become interested in these real life disappearances of real people, and did a ton of research on these cases, and in almost every case, the authorities, these were disappearances that took place in Japan, in almost every case, the authorities dismissed the insistence of the families that their loved one had to have disappeared not by their own volition. So this person would disappear and the authorities would say, oh, I guess they must have committed suicide, or I guess they ran away, or in the most ghastly idea, but an acknowledgement of like a bad actor. Oh, maybe there's a serial killer. We don't know. But for the most part, these cases were sort of not pursued as assiduously as they should have been because there was just no physical evidence at all. And the cases were all scattered. So it took a really long time for anyone to notice a pattern. This is all in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the only way that a pattern ever emerged was that the family members of these vanished people refused to give up. And the stories of these ordinary people whose lives were just completely turned upside down by vanishing into thin air, it almost seemed. A 13-year-old girl on her way home from tennis team practice, a young couple in love who were engaged and had gone for a walk on the beach. Like, just these people who had ordinary lives. They were not involved in organized crime. They were not suicidal. They were not, there was nothing in their lives that would suggest like, oh, they want to run away, they want to do away with themselves. And their families just, for years, would say, we know something happened. We're not going to give up. And they would travel. The parents of this very famous disappeared girl, Megumi Yokota, the father who had worked for a bank just retired to devote himself full time to, we're going to find our daughter. And if we don't find her, we're at least going to make every effort. And they had nothing to go on at all. And so I found that so moving. And the way in which these cases were solved to the extent that they were was that the family members, because they were so persistent, started to find each other. And I depict this a little bit in the book, that, ordinary people who are like, I feel like something terrible happened to my loved one, but the cops won't help me. They started finding each other and eventually really pushing for some reopening of these cases to happen. So in that way, I did feel like it was a power of love story, kind of, because I found that so moving. And then there's the family at the center of this book. And that's the way in which I also feel like the book is about the failure of love, in a way, because the marriage between the two parents who, are the parents of Louisa, this marriage is between two people who have a lot of secrets and a lot of pain, and they don't share it. And I was really interested in, how much of a stranger can someone that you share your life with be? Because in this case, they're married, but the wife particularly knows nothing about her husband's background. This is like Hiroshi all grown up. Hiroshi all grown up and not going by that name anymore, comes to the United States, marries a woman he meets in the United States, and never tells her anything. And it turns out to be problematic that he doesn't tell her anything, because then, when stuff goes crazy, she's like, who was this person? So I hope that answers your question a little.
If I may say, that's very common in Korean culture, and maybe some in Japanese culture, especially in the 60s, 70s. And so some of the people went through a lot of traumas, PTSD, World Wars and Korean Wars and whatever. And they have a lot of those guilt feelings, and they don't want to share any of anything negative, including my parents, same thing, just like that. When I read the book, it was like reading my parents' thing. So I could understand the dynamics of that.
I'm smiling so broadly not because I couldn't agree more, and really I think to answer the question most fully, because I didn't go this far, a lot of this had to do with my experience of my own father. I was very close to my father. We had a very, very loving relationship, the most supportive father you could imagine. My friends in college they couldn't believe I had an Asian father because it was okay with him that I wanted to write fiction. They were like, no, that can't be true. Are you sure? Are you sure he doesn't want you to be a lawyer who writes fiction? I was like, no, we were very close, but at the same time, and he did talk to me a lot about his experience, and yet so much was never talked about and explained. So there would be this constant struggle of this sort of American, like, tell me this, or asking questions, and, this enormous obstacle that had to be overcome. And it's the same with his whole family and within his family. His relatives that I never met as a child because they had all become so kind of estranged from each other. They all left Korea after the Korean War, and none of them just ever really wanted to talk to each other. And I remember at one point my cousin, a son of one of my father's siblings, we sort of found each other and became friends. Our parents didn't help us at all. And he said, this generation is so damaged. And it's heartbreaking, but I think I really have experienced that too. Yeah.
I'm curious about the title. I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit of flashlights that appear throughout the story. The first one, of course, in the doctor's office, the therapist's office, but then again, the disappearance. I don't know, I see it as some kind of, or I guess, or something, but I thought maybe you could talk about it.
Yeah, the flashlight significance, thank you. This is a story that I like because I feel that it explains a little bit about the sort of strange process of composing fiction, at least as I experience it. When I was writing the scene, that I read to you, the doctor's office, Louisa, this prickly child, the flashlight popped up in that scene, and it was connected to a memory that she had. The last time she ever saw her father, they were walking on the beach, and he was carrying a flashlight even though it wasn't dark, and she was like, oh God, he's always like super cautious, overprotective father, like it's not even dark and he brought a flashlight. So the flashlight just kind of was in the story, and a lot of the time when I'm writing, I don't have a lot of preconceived ideas of how a scene is going to go, and then I don't even really understand what works, why things work and why they don't work, but I can tell when something does work. Like, I was like, oh, the flashlight, that works, that's good. Like, she was on the beach with Dad, flashlight, doctor's office, flashlight, So I knew that there was some kind of connection there. But I didn't give it a second thought, to be totally honest. And when I was trying to make a short story out of this material, it was a very pragmatic decision to name the story Flashlight because there was a flashlight, and I'm very bad at titles. So I was just like, let's call it Flashlight. It was a very low stakes decision because it was a short story, but my problem with titles, because I'm so bad at them, if once I find one, I really don't want to have to do it again. So as the book grew and grew and grew and grew, I would often think, oh God, I hope nobody makes me call it something else, because I've got nothing else. It's just, but it seemed like the title seemed kind of random. So I finished a draft, and my literary agent, who's a very, very smart reader, read it. The draft was very different from this book, but of course much more similar to the book than the story had been. It was, a lot changed, but the basics were there. And we sat down to talk about it, and she said, well, I just love all of the symbolic work that the flashlight is doing. And I said, it is? I really had not noticed that the flashlight was doing this symbolic work. It makes me wonder, did anybody, when you were in high school, did anybody read The Great Gatsby, and did your teacher tell you that the green light at the end of Daisy's Dock was a very important literary symbol? So I've always wondered, did Fitzgerald plan that? Was he like, oh, this green light is going to be a great symbol? Or did he just put the light on the dock? And Gatsby's like, oh, Daisy. And then generations of English teachers have taught symbolism with that green light. So I realized, I read the draft myself, and there was how many flashlights were there? There weren't a lot, but the flashlight did have this kind of symbolic power that I hadn't noticed. But I think there's something, I'm doing this. Writing is a strange process, and I often tell my students, you don't plan things like any kind of art making. A lot of stuff happens that you don't consciously plan, but your better, bigger mind kind of understands what it's doing. And you just have to kind of throw a bunch of stuff on the page and then be smart enough to recognize what works and what doesn't. And my agent recognized it first. Once she did, I then did lean into it a little bit, I admit. I did add a flashlight or two after that point. So there was some tweaking and manipulating of the flashlight symbol once it was pointed out to me, but it was already doing its thing. The flashlight was already flashlighting. And happily, no one ever asked me to change the title.
I have one final question, because, so, again, thank you so much for today. Your stories all have so much detail, and sometimes authors can put so much detail it becomes heavy, and yours don't. You just want more, 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 more. Where does that come from, your need for that, and also how you share it?
Thank you, Debra. This is a question about detail, and thank you for what you said, because I was ready to complete your sentence with, and there's really too much detail. As I was reading that first scene, I was dropping details. I don't know if anyone was following along, but there are details in that scene that I was just like, oh my God, too many details. Like I actually skipped over a bunch of sentences when I was reading it, because there are a few details in there that to me now when I read feel excessive. I think that I err on the side of too many details. So as a younger writer, I loved descriptive writing, and I think that I was sort of in love with descriptive writing. Like I would walk around thinking, like the cream-colored vault of the auditorium. Like, I was always sort of trying to like find details, and I think a lot of my writing was excessively descriptive and lacked the purposeful sort of forward motion that writing really needs. Like I often will say to my students now, like, you've got to be careful what details you choose to share, because the reader really wants to know why. Why are you telling me this? If I were to write the story of our day together and I went into detail about what everyone was wearing, you all look fabulous, by the way, I'm wearing my distance glasses again. The reader would wonder, like, why am I being told what everyone's wearing? Is it important? Does it matter? And so there's always this question of like, is this a detail that is doing some work, or is it just because the writer's in love with, her own adjectives? So it's always this balance, because I tend to include too many. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Susan. A very hard act to follow, but good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So for those who have not met me, my name is Charlie Busuttil. I'm the proud chair of People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos. Unfortunately, you and I both know that I hold the unenviable position between you and food, so I shall be brief. I'd like to recognize some people here. First, on behalf of the board, heartfelt thank you to Susan. She's done a great job, and she's taken time out from her busy schedule. I picked her up 2.5 hours ago from Princeton Junction, so she enjoyed the riding of the Northeast Corridor, so I feel your pain. Secondly, I want to thank my fellow board members. We have 2 people here, Sumant and Abby. The newest member is Abby, and also Mike Aaron, who recently kind of left the board. Thank you for being here. The board members really serve as the heartbeat of the organization, because they really serve as the guiding light in terms of supporting us and giving us insight and giving me guidance, because I'm fairly new to nonprofits, so I thank them for that. I'm also delighted to see some former board members here and many of the current and past coordinators in the audience today, and I thank you for your support and your continued support of our organization. And a very, very special thank you to Debra. Debra made me wear a suit. I used to work for a law firm, and I've got probably 20 suits in my closet, which I haven't worn in years. And I'm still having difficulty wearing my business shoes, so if I trip going back, please forgive me. But Debra was very key, and she was a guiding light in terms of making sure that we continued, because these are very challenging times for not-for-profits, as you may know, but she really took to the challenge and said, we will push forward, and we really did. And so we have reinvigorated the board. Financially and structurally, we're in great shape, which really makes life a lot easier for us. And the last group I'd like to really thank is really you. We could not have done this without you, and I really thank you for your support, and we'll clap on that one too. It's really key to have people committed to an organization designed to do good. And we really take great pride in giving people the voice that they need during sessions, during tryouts and things of that nature. And that's been very, very carefully orchestrated through our director, as well as some of the great coordinators that we have out in the field. At this point, it's my great pleasure to invite you to meet and greet Susan. And our good friends at Labyrinth Books will be here to assist you with book purchases and signing, which will further help our cause. Please stay, enjoy the reception, and continue the conversation, and thank you for being here today.